Imagine you have this brilliant registered behavior technician, or RBT, on your team. Like, they are just phenomenal with the clients.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Their data collection is flawless. Their procedural integrity is sitting at 100%. But then the second you put them in a clinical team meeting with other staff, they completely shut down.
Yep. See it all the time.
They stop speaking, they avoid eye contact, and they just defer every single question back to you. So what do? Do you write them off as unmotivated? Do you assume they lack leadership potential and document that in their annual performance review?
Which is what a lot of people do, unfortunately.
Exactly. Or do you stop and realize that your specific clinical environment, like the way you run your meetings and demand this immediate, aggressive verbal participation, is actively punishing their cultural communication style?
That is the real question right there.
Because supervision isn't just about signing forms or, ticking off your 5% requirement. It's about building elite clinicians.
Yeah.
And if you aren't actively engineering equity into your supervision systems, you aren't just failing your supervisees, you are failing your clients.
You're failing the whole system, really.
100%. So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is absolute mastery of BACB 6th edition task list item I.3, which is identify and implement methods that promote equity in supervision practices.
It is such a critical topic.
It really is. We're going to look at what separates the top 1% of BCBA supervisors from the rest of the pack, how this translates clinically, and exactly how to dominate this material when you sit for your board exam.
And that scenario you just described, that happens every single day in clinics across the world.
Yeah.
The whole field of applied behavior analysis relies entirely on the quality of its practitioners, right? And that quality is forged in the fires of supervision. We're moving far beyond the days of supervision in name only.
Oh, yeah, where someone just watches a session for 20 minutes, gives a thumbs up, and signs a tracker.
Exactly. The current ethics code for behavioral analysts makes it unequivocally clear. Supervisors are completely accountable for the professional activities of their trainees.
Right.
So if we don't establish supervisory environments that actively promote equity, we compromise the integrity of our interventions. We risk, significant harm to both staff and consumers.
Yeah, and we violate the foundational core principles of our profession.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit, because the word equity gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
Usually in those corporate training seminars alongside trust falls and boilerplate PowerPoint presentations.
Oh, the dreaded annual HR module.
Right, exactly. But what does it actually mean in a strict clinical behavior analytic context? Like when we look at task list item I.3, what are the concrete measurable variables we are analyzing here?
Well, to define it clinically, we first have to separate equity from equality, because they are not synonyms. And treating them as such is where the systemic failures really begin.
So equality would be, what, treating everyone exactly the same?
Exactly. Equality is giving every single supervisee the exact same resources, the exact same feedback schedule, the same goals, the one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
Equity, on the other hand, is an individualized, function-based approach to supervision. It's acknowledging that your supervisees come to you with different cultural variables, different communication styles, and vastly different learning histories.
So what you're saying is we have to treat the supervisor-supervisee dynamic with the exact same functional rigor we apply to the client.
Yes, absolutely.
Like we've been skipping the baseline. It's about looking at the baseline repertoire of the individual trainee, identifying their specific environmental needs, and building from there.
You hit the nail on the head. If you look at the ethics code, specifically code 1.07 on cultural responsiveness and diversity, and code 4.07, incorporating and addressing diversity, behavior analysts are mandated to actively engage in professional development related to diversity.
And to evaluate their own biases, right?
Yes. These codes aren't just bureaucratic red tape. They are clinical guardrails. Furthermore, we have to evaluate the biases of our supervisees.
Right.
And this requires a conceptual framework known as cultural humility. Now, cultural humility isn't some badge you earn after a 1-hour CEU. It is an ongoing, lifelong process of self-reflection.
It's constant work.
It is. It requires you to continuously challenge your own assumptions, evaluate the power dynamics inherent in the supervisor-supervisee relationship, and actually adjust your behavior to meet the diverse needs of your trainees.
But wait, I can hear people saying right now, shouldn't I just treat all my RBTs exactly the same so it's fair?
Oh, I hear that all the time.
Right. Like if I give one RBT more support or a totally different type of feedback, Want the others think I'm playing favorites. That's the standard corporate argument, right? Treating everyone the same is the ultimate defense against claims of discrimination.
It is a really common misconception and a very dangerous one in our field, because equality without equity is a massive failure of individualization.
Yeah.
Let's map this directly to our clinical work. Would you write the exact same behavior intervention plan for every single client on your caseload, just to be fair?
Of course not. That would be completely unethical and honestly clinically disastrous.
Exactly.
Because a differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, a DRA, that only works if the specific reinforcer actually holds value in that client's unique environment.
Precisely.
Like for one client, the alternative behavior might need to be reinforced with social praise. But for another, it might require a highly specific tangible item, or maybe, a break from a demanding task.
The function dictates the intervention.
Exactly. You can't just hand everyone a sticker and call it a day.
You really can't. And those exact same behavioral principles apply to those we supervise.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, think about it. If you have a trainee whose learning history makes them highly receptive to direct, blunt verbal feedback,
Right.
and then another trainee whose cultural background or personal history makes that exact same direct feedback highly aversive, well, treating them equally by giving them both blunt feedback means you are effectively punishing the second trainee.
Oh, man. You're actually decreasing their future probability of asking questions.
Exactly. You have turned your supervision into a conditioned aversive stimulus. Supervision must be tailored to the unique environmental variables, assessment results, and goals of the individual supervisee.
Just as we don't write identical behavior plans for every client.
We absolutely cannot write identical supervision plans for every trainee.
See, here's where it gets really interesting, because when we look at the source material, we see how these failures of individualization actually play out in the real world.
Oh, definitely.
And they are often hidden behind the guise of good intentions.
Yeah.
So let's look at an applied ABA scenario pulled directly from the case studies we've reviewed.
Let's do it.
Imagine a clinic director. Let's say she's conducting quarterly audits of the caseloads, drive times, and supervision allotments of the BCBAs at her agency. She's digging into the raw data to assess overall clinical outcomes and review supervisory practices.
Which is a standard but critical organizational behavior management procedure.
Yeah.
Without that level of macro analysis, systemic ethical breaches can easily go unnoticed for years.
Right. But during this audit, she notices a distinct and honestly troubling pattern with one of her lead BCBA supervisors.
Okay.
This supervisor is consistently giving the hardest, most complex, and furthest in-home cases to RBTs of lower socioeconomic status.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. We are talking about cases with severe aggressive topographies, an hour-long commute in traffic, highly demanding family dynamics.
That's a recipe for burnout.
Exactly. But when the clinic director confronts the supervisor about it, the supervisor assumes these specific RBTs, quote-unquote, need the hours and the overtime pay.
Wow.
So they genuinely believe they're doing these technicians a favor.
That is wild.
And it gets worse. The audit also reveals that this same supervisor pulled an Asian American RBT off their current, highly stable clinic caseload.
Let me guess, to assign them to a newly immigrated Asian family.
Yes, out in the community. The supervisor assumed it was a perfect cultural fit.
Unbelievable.
But in doing so, they actively disrupted the RBT schedule, drastically reduced their direct billable hours because of the drive time, and effectively slashed their paycheck.
What's fascinating here is how multiple ethical violations are masquerading as helpful supervision.
Right, like they think they're being the good guy.
Exactly. This is the danger of unchecked assumptions. Let's break down the clinical failure, starting with the behavioral mechanism. First, this violates Code 1.08, non-discrimination, and Code 1.10, awareness of personal biases and challenges.
Because they're making assumptions based on demographics.
Yes. The supervisor is making massive, sweeping assumptions based on demographic variables rather than objective, individual assessments of the supervisee's actual skills, preferences, and environmental needs.
They are essentially stereotyping their own staff under the guise of efficient caseload management.
Precisely.
They aren't looking at the RBT as an individual clinician. They are looking at them as a demographic data point.
Exactly. Assuming an RBT of lower socioeconomic status wants to drive an hour away for a severe aggressive case simply because they, quote, need the hours, is a profound bias.
Yeah, it ignores the behavioral reality of burnout.
It ignores the wear and tear on their vehicle, which they might not be able to afford to repair. And most importantly, it ignores an assessment of their actual clinical competency for that specific case.
Right, like, does this RBT actually have the physical and emotional repertoire to safely implement a crisis management plan for severe aggression?
Exactly. Or are we just throwing them to the wolves because we assume they need the paycheck? That is not equity. That is exploitation disguised as opportunity.
Man, that is a heavy insight.
Yeah.
Exploitation disguised as opportunity. And the second part of that scenario is just as wild.
The reassignment?
Yeah,
Yeah.
reassigning the Asian American RBT based purely on perceived cultural matching. It feels like the supervisor looked at a complex human being and reduced them to a checkbox on an intake form.
It is a profound failure of cultural responsiveness. It assumes monolithic cultural practices. I
Right.
mean, Asia is a massive, incredibly diverse continent with thousands of distinct cultures, languages, and histories. Assuming that any Asian American RBT will automatically be a cultural fit for any newly immigrated Asian family is absurd.
It's honestly kind of offensive.
It is, and it completely ignores the direct financial and professional harm inflicted on the RBT by disrupting their stable environment.
They lost hours. They lost money.
Yep. And their clinical trajectory was altered without their consent, all based on a supervisor's unexamined bias. This is an explicit failure to implement equity.
Okay, so if that stereotyping and assumption-making is what equity isn't, how do we engineer what it actually is?
Right. Let's get to the methods.
Yeah, if I'm a BCBA listening to this, how does a top-tier supervisor actually implement methods that promote equity, as strictly required by task list item I.3? What are the actual behavioral mechanics?
It requires systematic, proactive methodologies. You cannot just hope to be equitable. You must engineer it.
Engineer it. Okay.
We can highlight 3 specific empirically validated methods based on the text. The first is scaffolding.
Okay.
Scaffolding is the provision of gradual, customized support based on the supervisee's specific baseline strengths and challenges.
Kind of like shaping, right?
Yeah.
But applied to professional skill acquisition.
Yes, very similar to shaping and behavioral skills training. The mechanism of scaffolding involves breaking down a complex terminal behavior into manageable steps, providing heavy reinforcement for early approximations, and systematically fading that support.
So what does that look like in practice?
Let's look at a practical example. If a supervisee from a culturally diverse background is struggling with the dominant communication style expected in your clinic's IEP or individualized education program meetings.
Wait, let me stop you there. What do we mean by dominant communication style?
That's an excellent question. In many Western corporate or clinical environments, the dominant communication style involves speaking loudly, asserting your opinions immediately, and even interrupting to make a point.
Oh, yeah. Very aggressive, very fast-paced.
Exactly. But in many other cultures, that behavior is considered deeply disrespectful. Active listening, waiting for a prolonged pause, and deferring to the perceived authority figure is the norm. So if your supervisee comes from a culture that values deference and your IEP meetings require aggressive assertion, your supervisee will appear unengaged or timid unless you intervene.
Got it. So how do we scaffold that without just, pulling them aside and telling them, hey, talk louder?
Well, an equitable supervisor doesn't just evaluate them poorly for not speaking up. They use scaffolding.
Okay.
They might start by having the supervisee present a single data point in a safe one-on-one setting, providing heavy, specific reinforcement for their delivery.
Shaping the behavior in a low-stakes environment.
Exactly. Then the next step might be having them lead a brief 5-minute update during a smaller team huddle. The supervisor gradually fades their own presence and support until the supervisee is confidently leading a full IEP or parent training meeting.
So the support matches the specific, individualized need of the trainee, acknowledging their starting baseline. That makes total sense. But if stereotyping is the failure and scaffolding is the intervention, how do we actually measure if it's working without our own cultural bias creeping into the grading?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. That seems like a massive blind spot, because if I am using a rubric designed by a historically white Western corporate board, isn't the quote-unquote objective metric itself inherently biased? How do we navigate that?
That brings us perfectly to the second method, which is the use of objective performance assessments. You hit on a crucial tension in the field.
Here.
Yes, historical rubrics can carry systemic bias. To counter this, If you are going to evaluate a trainee, it must be based on clear, unbiased criteria that measure observable clinical outcomes, not arbitrary behavioral topographies that are culturally dependent.
So like avoiding things like professionalism.
Exactly. You cannot evaluate a supervisee based on subjective impressions or informal gut feelings about their professionalism, which are almost always tainted by unconscious cultural biases.
Right, because if you're just writing down "seem disengaged today" on a feedback form, what does that actually mean?
It means nothing objectively.
That could just be a cultural difference in eye contact or listening behavior or even how they process information. You have to measure actual observable behavior that impacts the client.
Exactly. You must use structured evaluations tied directly to the BACB task list competencies. Did they implement the discrete trial correctly according to the written protocol?
Right.
Did they achieve 90% procedural integrity on the token economy implementation? Did their data collection show high inter-observer agreement?
Those are objective functional metrics.
Yes. They measure the effectiveness of the clinician's behavior on the client's environment rather than measuring how well the clinician mimics the supervisor's preferred cultural style.
That distinction is huge. We are measuring their impact on the client and not their ability to clone our personality.
Precisely.
I love that. Okay, what is the third method?
The third method is utilizing culturally relevant case studies in your supervision and training systems.
Okay.
When training your supervisees, the materials, role plays, and examples you use must reflect diverse backgrounds, diverse family structures, and diverse socioeconomic realities.
So they can actually see how ABA applies in various contexts, not just in a sterile, white picket fence suburban clinic where every family has a golden retriever, 2 cars, and unlimited free time to run trials.
Exactly. If all your training examples assume a 2-parent household with a high income, English as a first language, and the ability to purchase expensive alternative reinforcers,
You're not preparing your supervisee to serve the actual population.
you are setting them up for failure when they encounter a single parent working 3 jobs in an urban apartment complex where the primary reinforcers are heavily restricted.
Wow. Yeah, that's a completely different clinical landscape.
By integrating diverse case studies into your supervision, you teach the supervisee how to adapt evidence-based treatments to fit different cultural norms. You teach them how to identify reinforcers that are appropriate and accessible within different cultural contexts.
This actively builds their cultural responsiveness while promoting an equitable learning environment.
It really does.
So, what does this all mean for daily practice? We've talked about the ideal methods, scaffolding, the objective assessments, the diverse case studies, but let's transition into the pitfalls.
The traps.
Yes, I want to know the traps. Where do supervisors usually get this wrong, and what are the behavioral mechanisms behind those errors?
The source material highlights several major traps that consistently lead to ethical violations and ineffective supervision. Let's outline the top 3.
Sounds good.
Trap number 1 is subjective grading. This occurs when a supervisor evaluates a trainee based on their own learning history and unexamined biases, rather than the objective competencies outlined by the BACB.
Which is the exact opposite of the objective performance assessments we just discussed.
Exactly.
Can we dig deeper into how that manifests? Because I don't think most supervisors wake up and say, I'm going to subjectively grade someone today. It happens under the radar.
It absolutely happens under the radar. And it functions as an abolishing operation for the supervisee's future learning.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine a supervisor who grew up in an environment where speaking loudly, offering unsolicited opinions, and asserting yourself immediately in a conversation is a sign of confidence, intelligence, and leadership.
Sure. Very typical corporate climb behavior.
Right. Now, they are supervising a trainee from a cultural background where active listening, pausing significantly before speaking, and avoiding direct eye contact with authority figures is a sign of profound respect and cognitive processing.
Right.
If the supervisor relies on subjective grading, they will look at that trainee and evaluate them as lacking confidence, unprepared, or not leadership material.
Oh, man, and that goes right on their record.
Yep. As a result, the supervisor might withhold prime clinical opportunities, complex cases, or promotions from that trainee.
That is a massive trap, and it shows exactly why Code 1.10 regarding personal biases is so vital. You have to know what your own baseline assumptions are before you start grading someone else's behavior.
Absolutely.
Because if you don't evaluate your own bias, your grading system creates an artificial ceiling for your staff.
It absolutely does.
Okay, what is trap number 2?
Trap number 2 is the boilerplate supervision contract.
Oh, I see this everywhere.
It is a direct violation of task list item I.4,
Right.
which mandates that we select supervision goals based on an assessment of the supervisee's skills, cultural variables, and the specific environment.
But the trap occurs when an agency or a BCBA uses the exact same boilerplate supervision contract and the exact same sequence of goals for every single trainee who walks through the door.
Exactly.
Because it's easy. It
Yeah.
saves billable time. You just print the PDF, change the name at the top, and make them sign it.
Yeah.
But using a boilerplate contract is like a doctor handing the exact same eyeglasses prescription to every patient in the waiting room just to save time. It ensures that while everyone gets glasses, almost no one will actually be able to see.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and functionally it is exactly what happens. It saves time in the short term, but it destroys clinical development in the long term. A boilerplate contract fails to conduct a baseline assessment of the trainee.
Right, like what if the trainee already has a master's degree in special education and 10 years of classroom experience, but zero experience with severe self-injurious behavior?
Exactly. If your cookie-cutter contract forces them to spend the first 3 months reviewing basic classroom management while ignoring functional analysis of severe behavior, you're wasting their time and insulting their repertoire.
So true.
Mm.
And conversely, what if they need intensive support in professional communication due to English being their second language?
Mhm.
But your contract assumes fluent technical writing skills for behavior plans.
You set them up to fail. Equity demands an initial individualized assessment of the supervisee before the contract is even finalized.
It all comes back to the core science. We baseline, we individualize, we intervene.
Exactly.
We wouldn't skip a functional behavior assessment for a client, so why are we skipping the baseline assessment for our future clinicians?
It makes no sense.
All right, what is trap number 3?
Trap number 3 is one-and-done diversity training.
Oh boy.
This is the trap of treating cultural competence and equity as a single annual HR workshop rather than an ongoing daily process.
The classic check-the-box mentality. Like, we watched the video module, we clicked through the slides, we took the multiple choice quiz. We are now culturally competent for the fiscal year.
Which is a behavioral impossibility.
Right.
You do not acquire complex, generalized relational skills from a single PowerPoint presentation. If I want to teach a client a complex chain of behaviors, I don't just show them a video once a year and expect fluency.
That would be ridiculous.
True cultural responsiveness, as demanded by Code 1.07 and 4.07, is an ongoing process of active listening, behavioral skills training, and balanced feedback during every single supervisory interaction.
It means incorporating diversity topics into your weekly one-on-one meetings.
Yes, it means actively questioning your treatment plans and asking, is this goal socially valid for this specific family's culture, or is it just convenient for our clinic?
Right.
If supervisors treat diversity as a separate, isolated event, they will never engineer true equity into their daily supervision practices. It must be woven into the fabric of the clinical culture.
I love that. Woven into the fabric. Okay, so let's get tactical. For everyone listening who is preparing to crush their board certification, or even for current BCBAs who need a refresher on the strict parameters of our ethics, when you sit down for the exam, how does Pearson VUE test this?
We need the strict exam-focused logic.
Exactly. Because it's one thing to understand the theory, but how do we navigate the multiple choice minefield?
Well, the exam will test your ability to apply these ethical codes and task list items to highly specific, often ambiguous scenarios. You must rely on the precise language and the underlying behavioral logic of the BACB.
Let's break it down.
I've got 3 critical exam strategies.
Strategy 1, let's go.
Strategy 1. If a scenario asks for the first step a supervisor should take when a cultural or communication discrepancy arises with a supervisee,
Okay, what do we choose?
choose the option that involves evaluating your own personal biases, referencing Code 1.10, or initiating open, objective dialogue with the supervisee.
So why is that the rule?
Yay.
What is the logic behind choosing self-evaluation first?
The reason Pearson VUE wants you to choose self-evaluation first is based on the behavioral principle of stimulus control. You cannot effectively alter a supervisee's behavior until you first identify how your own biases are acting as an abolishing operation for their learning.
Oh, wow.
If you don't evaluate yourself first, your subsequent interventions will be flawed.
And what should they not choose in that scenario? Like, What are the distractors?
Do not choose any option that says immediately reassign the supervisee or terminate the supervision contract.
Right, because that's what that clinic director did in the earlier example.
Exactly. Reassigning a supervisee at the first sign of a cultural mismatch is an avoidance behavior. It is an escape contingency for the supervisor that fails to build the supervisee's skills and fails to address the supervisor's own biases.
So the first step is always to look inward, evaluate the bias, and communicate.
Always.
That makes perfect clinical sense. First step, self-evaluate and communicate. Never immediately escape the demand. Okay, strategy 2.
Strategy 2. If you see a question where a supervisor gives all trainees the exact same supervision goals in order to maintain fairness or prevent favoritism,
Choose the answer that identifies this as an error.
yes, precise.
Because that's the equality versus equity trap we spent so much time unpacking earlier.
Exactly. The exam wants to ensure you deeply understand task list item I.4. Supervision must be individualized based on a baseline assessment of the supervisee's skills, cultural variables, and environment.
So any answer choice that champions fairness through identical treatment is a distractor designed to test your knowledge of individualization.
Reject it. Identify the failure to individualize as the core clinical error.
So if you see the phrase fairness via identical goals, immediately flag it as a trap. Awesome. Let's hit strategy 3.
Strategy 3. If the question asks how to ensure fair and equitable evaluations of a trainee's clinical skills over time,
Choose the option that relies on objective, criteria-based performance assessments.
yes,
So we are looking for very specific, measurable terms in the answer choices. Things like procedural integrity checklist, behavioral skills training rubrics, or inter-observer agreement on data collection.
exactly right. Choose those over any options that suggest informal observations, supervisor impressions, peer reviews without established criteria, or global rating scales.
Because subjective evaluations are breeding grounds for unconscious bias.
The exam will always reward the data-driven, objective, and measurable choice, because that is the bedrock of our science.
It really is.
Yeah.
Man, if we synthesize everything we've covered today, the definitions, the real-world clinic examples, the traps, and the strict exam logic, we arrive at the core of what it means to be a top-tier supervisor.
It's powerful stuff.
It's not just about managing people. It's about engineering an environment where their success is the most probable outcome.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it leads us to a crucial clinical power insight.
Okay, lay it on me.
True equity isn't a checkbox. It is a measurable, function-based approach to supervisor behavior. This brings in task list item I.6. Apply a function-based approach, such as performance diagnostics, to assess and improve supervisee behavior.
So we are essentially turning the science of behavior analysis back onto ourselves. We become the subjects of our own analysis.
Exactly. If your supervisee is failing to meet expectations, if they are making clinical errors, or if they are consistently missing deadlines, the elite supervisor does not immediately blame the supervisee's work ethic or attitude.
Right, because those are mentalistic explanations that give us no path to intervention.
Exactly. The elite supervisor runs a performance diagnostic on their own supervision methods.
Oh, I love that.
Are your instructions actually clear, or are they shrouded in technical jargon the supervisee hasn't mastered yet? Are you utilizing scaffolding, or did you just throw them into the deep end of a complex case and expect them to swim? Are you providing timely, specific, positive reinforcement? Or are you only interacting with them to deliver corrective feedback, thereby making your presence highly aversive?
This raises a massive, uncomfortable question for anyone in a leadership role.
It does. It forces you to realize that if you do not adjust your supervision to their learning history and their cultural variables, you are the barrier to their success.
Wow.
Equity means taking absolute responsibility for the environment you create for your trainees. You must engineer the contingencies that make their clinical mastery inevitable.
That is huge. Next time you sign a supervision form, ask yourself, am I just managing this person to get through the day, or am I adjusting my environment to actively build them into a top 1% clinician?
Exactly.
If this helped you, follow behavioral intelligence, share this episode with another RBT or BCBA who's studying, and leave a comment or review. That's how we grow and how I keep creating high-level content for you.
At Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc., we build clinicians, not just test passers. www.amethysttherapyservices.com, IOinfo@amethysttherapyservices.com.